All right, everyone, welcome to week 4, I believe it is, right, of our time together and the history and effects of anti-Semitism. I pray that you've been enjoying the lessons so far as we're just kind of skimming through and scratching the surface again, trying to identify the irrational nature of anti-Semitism in the world and throughout history, and how it affects us. How many here would say that have you ever, maybe perhaps going through the class now up to this point, or maybe before the class, have you identified any anti-Semitic thoughts that you can say, hey, that was me at one time, or maybe even recently? We've all been there, right? I think all of us probably have. And now here we are. So Hashem has a sense of humor, right? To keep saying that. I'm going to bring you right along. Someone sent me an article. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but they were saying that the gentleman who was responsible for shooting the officers in Dallas last week apparently was a part of a very, very anti-Semitic group. So, a lot of these things are kind of interconnected, intertwined, and what have you. So we're going to jump right in here and talk a little bit about what we left off from last week and didn't get to cover in last week's chapter. So going into the time period of moving towards the famous Inquisition that most people know, they've heard of the Inquisition, 1492. It just happens to be the same year that Columbus sailed the. Could you shut that door back there? Could you close that door? Just kind of get some bleed over sound. Thank you so much. So the same year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 is when the Inquisition started. Most people don't realize how long it lasted. The Inquisition went from 1492 up into the 1800s. So it was a very long period of time that the Inquisition happened. But let's talk what happened historically just prior to that time. So on the timeline here, we have roughly the early part of the 1300s. There were two religious orders in the Catholic Church that sprang up. One was the Dominican order, and the other was the Franciscan order. Both of these were very, very bad in terms of anti-Semitism. But they went about really reinforcing the idea of distrusting Jews in general. And they traveled everywhere, and their monks spread myths and lies about the Jews. And they claimed that Jewish people were routinely involved in ritual murder and desecrating the host. Who knows what the host is? And anybody? Yes, the wafer, desecrating the host, because it was believed in Catholicism that one is kind of gross, but once you put the wafer in your mouth, it literally becomes flesh. And once you drink the wine, it literally becomes wine. Now, I mean, really, it's so crazy. If you think about if a Catholic person, priest or whatever, is trying to reach a Jewish person, that type of religion is the most disgusting type of religion. Forget all the arguments about whether or not Yeshua is the Messiah. Just that one thing alone would cause any Jewish person to revolt. Just like the theology from a Protestant point of view that you knock on a Jewish person's door, and you say, hey, JC has come to set you free, to save you, and now you can eat pork. I mean, to an observant Jew, that is like, what? The Messiah doesn't come to do that. That's revolting. And we have no interest in that. But they went around spreading these kinds of lies. And, of course, they also said that they poisoned wells, that Jewish people poisoned wells, which we talked last week about the Black Plague. They felt it came from the water, and the Jews poisoned the wells. So during the plague years, I'm sure that was a fun part of history, wasn't it? Wouldn't you like to be around during the plague years? Yeah, during the plague years, in the 14th century, these stories, it says here, led to great massacres of Jews in Barcelona and other parts of Spain. So So the Franciscan and Dominican friars, they went about this. So then riots started breaking out because now you have people that are believing that Jewish people are poisoning wells. They're desecrating the host. They are doing all kinds of bad things, killing Christian children and doing ritual sacrifice on them and so on. So in 1378, there was a high-ranking Franciscan priest here named Ferran Martinez, who actually had a campaign against the Jews of Castile. So it says here, sermon after sermon, he called the Christians to expel all Jews from Spain. So he's the one who really started this concept of expelling all the Jews for Spain. Riots began to break out. Jewish people would be murdered and so on. But something different happened in Spain that had not happened up until this point. And probably, I suspect, is just simply a matter of, enough is enough. We're tired of dying. We're tired of being burned at the stake. It hasn't happened. Now, maybe there was some concepts of, Mashiach hasn't come yet. This isn't working. So let's just convert, okay? Let's convert. So a lot of Jewish people in Spain were forced to convert, forced to convert, basically convert or die. Whereas in centuries before, Jews would say, kill me. For some reason in Spain, they said, you know what, let's convert. So they would convert by, in this case, it says here, between 1391 and 1340, there was more than 100,000 Jewish people who converted. And it worked out great because once they became converted, automatically they were given full citizenship. They could now have businesses. They were given rights to have positions of authority. So this is great. For the first time ever, if you can imagine you're a Jewish person in Toledo, Spain, for the first time ever, you can walk around as a regular citizen and you can have your own business. Maybe you could get elected to a governmental position. And keep in mind, they were called conversos. These conversos, they were literate. They could read, they could write. So naturally, someone who's literate gets the job of maybe tax collector or magistrate or something like that. Well, now you have all the Christians out there who are looking at these new Christians, these conversos, and now they're jealous. Now they hate them because they used to be Jews, and they hate the fact that now they're equal with everybody. Now think about how sick that is. That you go around wanting, Jews are evil, Judaism is evil. Now you want to force them to convert to Christianity, do or die. And then they say, you know what? You're right. I convert. I accept the tenets of the faith. I go to baptism at the priest, at the church or whatever, and here I am. And you're like, all right, great. Well, now they're your peer, and now they're getting a job. Maybe now they're the tax collector who's knocking on your door and saying it's time to pay the church the taxes. And now you hate them because of all this. What's it tell us? It tells us that it's a spiritual thing. It's not just Judaism. It's deeper than that. And so this happened. So it's one of the quotes in the book says, officials in Toledo and elsewhere responded to these charges, these accusations. What were the accusations? The people were accusing these new Christians of practicing Jewish customs and rituals, which was, as it says here, a false charge. But they were saying, hey, you know what? These new Christians really are just faking it. They're really Jews who are just pretending to be Christians. This is what the Inquisition was all about. It was inquiring about whether or not they're actually practicing Judaism. There's two parts to the Inquisition. The first part was get all the Jews out or kill them. The second part was, now that they're all gone, you got all these conversos, let's go inquire and see, are they lighting candles on Friday night? Are they still eating kosher? If they're doing any Jewish practice, they were considered guilty and they would be tortured and or killed. And that was the point. So officials in Toledo elsewhere responded to the charges of them doing Jewish practice, not by defending the converso, which was they're supposed to because they're Christians, but now, and I think this is so interesting when you think about this in light of Judaism today and even Messianic Judaism. They now required a purity of blood as proof of being a true Christian. So now you couldn't be a true Christian if you had Jewish blood. Now think about that. This can be a complicated topic, but I just want to kind of There's an idea in Judaism today that you can't really be a true Jew unless you're born of Jewish blood, a Jewish mother specifically. Even though within Jewish teaching, within the Talmud, the Halakha and all that a convert, someone who converts to Judaism, is a Jew in every respect. And, in fact, Jews in general, our father Abraham was a convert. So we are a nation of converts. Someone said, I was monitoring a conversation. I was not involved in it. That had to do with someone I knew who was a believer in Yeshua and still is, but they went through a formal conversion to Judaism. Still believe in Yeshua. They're like Lapid, right? They had really, really close friends who were Messianic Jews and really took issue with that. And now, since they found out they did that, they've parted fellowship with them. This couple parted fellowship with this other couple. And I was reading the exchange, and one of the exchanges from the Messianic Jews was, you can't find in the Bible anywhere where Gentiles were compelled to become Jews, which actually, that's so not true. I don't even know where to begin with that. But they said, if you're a Gentile, you'll always be a Gentile, and if you're a Jew, you're always going to be a Jew. And I read that, and I thought, wow, that is such a remarkable statement. Who can tell me why that's wrong? Or it's kind of an open question, but what's the fallacy of that?
You taught a couple months ago that Gentile really means idol worship.
Right.
And if you turn from worshiping idols to worshiping Adonai, you're no longer Gentile.
Exactly, right? The term Gentile, actually literally means idol worshiper. In the Webster's Dictionary, the original Webster's Dictionary in history, it's really irrefutable. People try to say, oh, it just means somebody from the nations. No, it doesn't. If you actually look up the word, that's what it means. It means an idol worshiper. So there's a fallacy there. Anybody else got another thought about why that would be another part would be a fallacy? Very good. Very good. If it was really true that a Jew is always a Jew and a Gentile is always a Gentile and no one can ever change that status, there would be no Jews because there would be no Abraham. He would just be Abram. You see, it's so simple. If no one can ever convert, then how did Abram become Abraham? It just doesn't make sense. But this goes back, I think, spiritually to a blood purity idea. And unfortunately, it's on both sides of the fence sometimes. Because even if you look at books on conversion today in a Jewish circle, converts will tell you that unfortunately, even though theoretically within Judaism, a convert is a Jew in every respect, absolutely, physically, spiritually, every respect, according to Jewish law, it's even forbidden to ask someone if they're a convert or to even bring it up. It's considered shaming a Jew. However, the practical reality is in a lot of segments, converts complain that they never feel, the community never helps them feel 100% all in. That's why I have people come here, and it does. This irritates me too. I've said two things that irritate me today. So, that's unusual, but. People come here from time to time, not very often, but like once a year or maybe twice a year. First-time guests will come in and say, well, how many people here are actually Jews? And I'll look at the congregation, I'll say, everybody, unless you're a first-time guest. First of all, that is such an anti-Semitic question to ask. It's incredibly anti-Semitic to ask that question. It is not a question that you would be asked if you attended a traditional synagogue. They don't go around the synagogue and say, well, let's see, everybody here. Look, you attend the synagogue, you're presumed to be Jewish unless you have a private conversation with the rabbi, and he might ask you privately just to know where you're at. But in terms of just a general question, you would never say, well, that person's a convert, and that person wasn't born Jewish. That is totally not kosher in a Jewish context. So, but going back to this, it says they want to have Jewish blood. They were considered they were considered unworthy and unfit if they didn't have the Jewish blood. And they were now being segregated in much the same way that Jews are segregated. So now you had Jews being segregated from the Christians, but now you have the new Christians, the conversos, who are now being segregated because there's a jealousy. This is why we mentioned, I think, and maybe in a previous class, that assimilation, some people do assimilation for two reasons. One is just they don't want to keep the commandments. It's just easier to not live Jewishly in their own minds. But another reason that people assimilate is that they think that they'll be accepted, right? That's always a trick of the Yetzer Hara. It's always a trick of the Yetzer Hara that at work or in your social endeavors, wherever it is, if you just go along to get along and you assimilate, then everybody will be comfortable with you. But the fact of the matter is, spiritually, for the Jewish person, that is never true. That you could be as goy or try to be as goy as the person next to you, and it's not going to work out. And here's a prime example of it. These people had gone through all the motions to be true converts. They were tired of dying, and yet now they find themselves in the ghetto again. But now they're in the ghetto as new converts of Christianity. I'm sure that had to be incredibly frustrating and scary. So it says here that, in a sense, officials in Toledo were saying that Jews were not just members of a religious group, but were in fact members of a race. Anyone can change religion, but a person cannot change his or her blood. Now, think about what I just said about that conversation. They said a Jew is always a Jew and Gentile is always a Gentile. A person can't change their bloodline, which is fundamentally opposite of what the Bible says, actually. This is why I don't know if you come up out when and if one comes up out of the waters of conversion. In the synagogue, the rabbis say over you, you've now been born again, a son of Abraham. That's a Jewish phrase, born again, a son of Abraham. Why? Well, because it's believed that once you come up out of the waters of the mikveh, whatever pagan lineage you had is cut off, and your new lineage is Abraham and Sarah. So now you're a child of Abraham. This is why the definition of a Jewish person, when you really get down to it, a definition of a Jew is not someone who's born of a Jewish mother, although halakhically that's true, but ultimately it's a child of Abraham and Sarah. Okay, whereas Esau was a child of Abraham and Hagar, but Sarah is implied in that statement. So they accuse new Christians of being false Christians, led astray by guess who? Who can guess? Led astray by the evil Jews who were guilty of blood rituals and devil worship. So the Jews we're being said we worship the devil. As a result, violent attacks happened on the conversos. So this is just prior to 1492. All this is going on. And then in January of 1492, the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, they finally defeat the last Muslim stronghold in a place called Grenada. And they decide that it's time to expel all Jews out of the land. So just 3 months after that, in March, they issued an order addressing to the people of Spain, particularly to the Jews within the nation, that the presence of Jews has, quote, resulted in great damage and detriment of our holy Catholic faith. Therefore, they write, after much deliberation, they resolved that all Jews and Jewesses should be ordered to leave our kingdoms and that they never be allowed to return. And any Jew who remained in Spain after July of 1492 would incur punishment by death and confiscation of all of their property. So, all Jews had to leave or they were going to be killed because they were considered a detriment. And this happened in 1492, which happened to be the same year that Columbus's journey began to try to find the New World. The actual edict itself, when the Jews were literally expelled, occurred on the 9th of Av, which is the same day that the spies came back with their evil report in the land, and the same day that both temples were destroyed. And I think I read somewhere else where it was also the same day that World War I started, I believe it was, if I'm not correct. But the 9th of Av has not been a good day on the Jewish calendar, which is why it's a day of fasting and prayer for Jews, the 9th of Av, which is coming up this year, August the 5th, I believe. I could be wrong about that. So the new Christians, these conversos, one of the charges against them was that they would be Judaizing other Christians. So now you have this insidious plot within Christianity of not wanting any of the Jewish stuff to come in to the fold. Nothing Jewish, right? You don't want any of that Judaizing stuff going on. So anyway, but this wasn't the only Inquisition. And I think that's important to know as well. We talk about the Spanish Inquisition because it lasted the longest and it was the most famous. But there were other such expulsions, really is the better way to put it, such expulsions. So there was 3 in France. The first was in 1182. Then the next was in 1306. And then in 1394, the Jews were expelled from France. England in 1290. Germany in 1348 and 1498, Hungary in 1349 and 1360, Lithuania in 1442, and also 1495. Did we ever have any, it's a trick question. Did we ever have any expulsions in the United States? Were Jews ever expelled from the U.S.? Anybody? No? No? They turned it around. That's true. They turned around. That was during World War II. But within our own borders, have we ever expelled Jews out of our own area? No? Probably y'all have never heard of what I'm about to tell you. Civil War. So during the American Civil War, when the Union Army took control of Tennessee and the regions of northern Alabama and northern Mississippi and southern Kentucky, well, they already had Kentucky technically, but anyway, a famous general by the name of U.S. Grant issued a proclamation expelling all Jews from those territories. Yes. And his reasoning was he didn't like their trade practices. He thought they were swindlers or whatever. They were money changers, that kind of stuff. U.S. Grant was an anti-Semite. And so he issued a proclamation that all Jews should be expelled from Tennessee. Now remember, I say remember, I can't remember if I've told this class or not, but there was a significant number of Jews who lived in the American South. Significant number. The largest synagogue was in Charleston, South Carolina. 1/3 of all Jews in the Civil War lived in Louisiana. So there was a significant number. So he got them all out. Now, the Jewish leaders in the North heard about this edict and they appealed to President Lincoln, and Lincoln rescinded the order. And that was that. But it just shows you that there was an expulsion proclamation, however brief, within the United States at the hands of a leading general of the Union Army who would later become president of the United States. It just goes to show you that this idea is rampant everywhere. It's as we talked about before. Every culture, I don't care who you are, if you're Anglo or Spanish or black or whatever, everybody, every one of us, our ancestors at some point in time have experienced racism and prejudice. And we do so probably today at different levels. Normally that doesn't last. It doesn't last. And so it seems like this issue with our people, the Jewish people, is something that is just peculiar and just seems to permeate every time period. It doesn't matter where you go. So, in 1492, there was a man named Luis de Torres, and he converted on the 9th of Av, the day that Columbus' ships were about to leave Spain. And the reason he did is he was hoping that he could either A, be a part of a group that would help find a refuge for Jewish people where they could live out their Jewishness in peace and safety, or he was hoping that he could run into other Jews who were already living in some far off eastern land and make his home with them. Now, I've heard that Columbus himself was Jewish, but I haven't. Does anybody ever heard that before? Okay, all right. So that it's not mentioned here. That's why I was not able to confirm that from this book. But it says in the writings, this is actually from the diary of Louis de Torres. It says, Columbus thought that he would reach China and the Far East, and he would locate the exiled Jews from the lost 10 tribes. And he wanted me with him because of my knowledge of Hebrew to be able to communicate with them. So Columbus's secret mission was, I'm going to go find the lost 10 tribes. He tells the king, I'm going to go find, a path to the east. Well, he ends up finding the Caribbean, really, first. So Lewis also writes, the fateful day of our expulsion for Spain was the 9th of Av in the Jewish calendar year 5252, which is also the year 1492. That day marked the tragedy of the destruction of both holy temples, and many centuries before and now, one more tragic event was added to that mournful day. 300,000 people, half the number of those who came out of Egypt, descended to the Mediterranean shore, searching for passage to a new land, to a land where they could openly practice Judaism, and I was one of them. However, I was not a refugee. I had been commissioned to join Christopher Columbus's voyage of discovery. I agreed to accompany him because I hoped that we would find, or that if he found Jewish brethren, I would be able to live my life in peace and freedom. Don Rodriguez, his uncle, Don Gabriel Sanchez, Alonso Lacour, and Rodrigo de Triana, Juan Cabrera, Dr. Brena, and Dr. Marco all agreed with my reasoning and joined, all but except for Rodrigo. They sailed on other ships. We're a large group of conversos living in perpetual fear of Inquisition, hoping that we would find a way out of the precarious situation that we were in. And this is why they ended up finding the Caribbean, and this is why you have so much Jewish culture and Jewish areas in places like Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and all these other areas. Have any of you seen or heard of the book, The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean? No? It exists. So there was a man, and I'll have to pull the book off my shelf and read some clips from it maybe next week. But there was a man who's a Jewish man who many generations grew up in Jamaica. His last name was, I believe, Enriquez. And so he was a prominent member of the synagogue in Kingston. He's passed away now. Unfortunately, he died of cancer a few years ago. But he wrote a book. I believe it's Enriquez. It might have been his friend who was Enriquez there. But anyway, they are light-complected. They're Spanish by heritage, but they're light-complected Spaniards with this Jamaican brogue. And he wrote this book called The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. And it turns out that many of the pirates from history were Jews. Port Royal was in Jamaica. In fact, when you fly to Kingston, when you fly to Kingston, you land at Port Royal. The airport is out, it's a peninsula out at sea. Now, Port Royal in the mid-1600s, there was a massive earthquake that hit that city, and it all sank into the sea. And you can go tour those areas. There's not a whole lot left of it now, but you can tour the old fort, and some of the homes are still cattywampus, and you walk through them. That's part of the thing, right? So there's nice beaches out there. We've been to Port Royal many times, and it was known as the wickedest city on the planet at the time because all the pirates, Blackbeard, all these guys were there, and many of them were Jews, and so. The book just talks about the various Jewish pirates, and part of their motive was when they saw a Spanish galleon, they said, we're going to get our gold back. Yeah, that was the whole thing. It was about getting our money back that they stole from us. And the king and queen of Spain had awarded Jamaica to Columbus. It was like his personal kingdom. which was a really nice kingdom back there. And Jamaica's a pretty beautiful island, especially if you can imagine it. What was that? 300-400 years ago, whatever. It would have been pristine out there in the middle of the Caribbean. It's like a big mountain in the middle of the ocean like that. But so you have the Jewish pirates of the Caribbean and so on. So that is the period known as the Inquisition. And of course, like I said, it went on for several hundred years. I think today I don't even think today that there's many Jews who live in Spain. There may be a resurgence of it. Of course, in this day and age, what Jewish person wants to go visit France? I mean, did anybody see the report where they were making kippahs out of men's hair so that you could wear a kippah, but it would blend into your own hair so nobody could tell you were wearing it? Because in France, if you wear a kippah, walking down the street, mind your own business, you will 90% chance you're going to get roughed up, attacked, maybe killed. It's bad right now in France, really bad. Of course, we had all the terrorists stuff that's going on in France, but France is really bad. But a lot of people don't realize how bad France was as a hotbed of anti-Semitism before. France collaborated with the Nazi government, really, and sending the Jewish people to the concentration camps. So moving forward, any questions so far on any of that, or any input that y'all have? Something I might have not realized or left out? No? Okay. So moving forward a little bit in time to getting into the 1500s, there's about a decade or so moving forward. Christianity was widespread all over Europe. Catholic Church had a stronghold on everything. And the idea was that conformity was the rule of the day. It was considered dangerous to have anybody living within your community that was not considered one of the brethren. And as you can imagine, that pertained most specifically to Jewish people. And it was believed that these people that weren't of the faith, they would be considered dangerous to perpetuating Christianity. So you have this universal faith. Everybody's under the Catholic Church. If you're Jewish, frankly, I'm not really sure how Jews survived in Europe. It really is miraculous if you think about it. Everything that you had to go through. You had, during the Inquisition, I forgot to mention that Portugal accepted Jews coming from Spain. They accepted them, but you had to pay a big fee, and you could only live there for about 5 years, and then after that, you either had to leave or convert. Other wealthy Jews were able to pay a higher fee and live there permanently. But then, a few years later, the son of the king and queen of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of the king and queen of Spain. And so the king and queen of Spain said, we're not going to let our daughter live in a country where there's Jews. So then Portugal expelled all the Jews so that the daughter could marry, or the son could marry the daughter or whatever, and they could do this union. So now the Jews are finding themselves as a wedding gift fleeing Portugal. I mean, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you do that. This is why in halakha, when a convert comes to be, and says he comes to a rabbi to be converted, he says he wants to be converted, it's brought down in the halakha that it says, I'm going to paraphrase, why do you want to do this? Don't you understand that we're oppressed everywhere? We're hunted, we're mistreated everywhere we go? And if the convert says, yes, and I'm unworthy, then he's to be accepted immediately accepted. There's no further pushing him away or whatever. Well, there's a lot of wisdom to that, I think, because, frankly, for those at Sar Shalom who go through conversion, or any synagogue for that matter, if, God forbid, there should ever be a registration of the Jews like there was in Germany, all of us would have to register. Of course, we're Americans. We'd end up fighting our way out, but that's beside the point. In theory, we'd have to register, in theory, okay? And it's important to know. That has to be the commitment level. That has to be the commitment level. In fact, there's a midrash, forget the source. I know where to find it. I just can't think it off the top of my head. But there's a midrash that talks about the phony converts who come into Judaism and they adopt, they start eating kosher and start living the life and everything. But then when trouble happens, they quickly take the mezuzah down, take the seat off and all that. And it talks about how Hashem laughs at them, that they're not sincere. So it says here, many scholars now believe, going in this 1500 time frame, I guess I should say that this is where humanism and a little bit of the Enlightenment era begins to dawn. And so people are being more intellectual. And so many scholars believe that they can study Jewish texts at this point and still remain true to Christianity. What a novel idea. This seems so barbaric and so, but it does and it doesn't. So it says here, you can still study Jewish texts and still remain true to Christianity. Today, that idea does not seem so very radical, but it does, actually. I'll never forget, I was in a Messianic congregation building. It was not on Shabbat. And they had the gift store open. And I was, looking at stuff, and they happened to have a book on the shelf, and it was something like the Introduction to the Talmud or something like that. And this is going many, many years back. And so I looked up there and I saw that and I thought, well, that's probably interesting. And I went to reach up to get it, to pull up and to look at it. And the lady in the gift store, who was a member of this congregation, said, be careful with that, because it's got a lot of information that is just, troublesome. And at the time, I had not spent much time studying the Talmud. I just didn't know what I didn't know. And I thought, I thought it was weird because I like to think anyway that I look at things analytically. And my first thought was, well, if that's the case, then why do you have it in your bookstore? So, but this is the attitude. The attitude was, it's Jewish literature. That could really cause some spiritual harm to you. Well, and then I read this and go, well, that's not so radical. Actually, I just experienced that a few years ago. Or I say a few years ago, but probably a decade or so ago now. But now looking back and reading the Talmud writings, nothing could be further from the truth, really. But it's like this weird superstition that exists. So anyway, today, that doesn't seem so radical. It says, but in the 16th century Europe, it was revolutionary. Most Christians still believe that Hebrew books were so dangerous that they had to be destroyed as a result. So it says here, now this is an interesting concept, because remember he said that most of the greatest anti-Semites in history were formerly Jews. It's a phenomenon. So there it says here, there was a recent convert from Judaism by the name of Johannes, I'm going to mispronounce the name, Pfefferkorn. You Germans in the group will correct me later. In 1509, Pfefferkorn, with the help of his Dominican friars at the University of Cologne, which is in Germany, persuaded Maximilian I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, to confiscate and burn all Jewish books with the exception of the scriptures, since by these means Jews grow more firmly planted in their faithfulness. So here's this former Jewish person who converted, and now he leads a campaign to go collect all Hebrew texts and burn them. It's all part of the witch hunt. So there was a man named Reuchlin who recommended preserving Hebrew books because they might help Christian scholars in deriving proof of our Christian faith. What a novel idea. He scorned those who wanted to destroy Jewish books, even though they had never read one. How many of you have ever had a conversation with somebody who said, don't read that Talmud's evil, and then you talk to them and find out they've never actually even opened one up. They've never held. And so whenever I get in a conversation with somebody who is railing against the Midrash Rabbah or the Talmud, you shouldn't read that stuff. My first question before I get into all the whys and what fors is, wait a minute. Have you ever in your life physically held in your hand a copy of either, opened it up, and with your hand physically turned a page and read any of it? I don't accept internet stuff, okay? So don't tell me that you went on and downloaded a copy or whatever, because that's crazy. I'm just talking about if you actually held it physically in your hand. And to this day, I've never had anyone say yes. I had someone one time, I think I told you, that said, well, I've read the Talmud. And I said, well, that would be like saying I read the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, that's 72 volumes. So the likelihood is you haven't read it. There was another Hebrew roots guy I saw, and it's kind of comical. Somebody shared the clip with me because it was about something else. But I picked up on something, and he said, I just want to study the Torah, but I don't want any of that Midrash, Talmud, or tractate. So I wrote back to the person who sent me this link because they had a question because they were pretty young in this. And I said, I just want to tell you that there's no Jewish work called tractate. A tractate is a section of the Talmud. So again, my guess would be the person who's talking about it doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's what it's talking about here, is even they want to destroy all these books, they think they're evil, but they've never read any of them. They've never opened one up to explore it. If someone wished to write against the mathematics, he writes, and was himself ignorant in simple arithmetic or mathematics, he would be made a laughingstock. Isn't that true? If someone wants to write against mathematicians, if someone wants to write against mathematicians, and he himself is ignorant of simple arithmetic or simple mathematics, he would be a laughingstock. Isn't that true? So if you want to talk to someone about Judaism, about faith and Messiah, about first century Judaism, how many of you have ever heard a pastor, any pastor, said this is what Jews believed back then or whatever? Anybody ever heard a pastor teach about that from the pulpit? This is what Jews believe? Nobody? I've heard it a lot. Pastors in the pulpit will say, well, this is what Jews believe, this is what they taught. And most of the time, it's not accurate. But this is what he's saying. He's saying, how can we talk about something we don't know anything about? We want to dialogue about first century Judaism. We want to dialogue about what Yeshua taught and why. But we don't want to explore Jewish literature, so we become a laughingstock. So he was advocating for reading the Jewish literature and actually employing it to try to gain knowledge from it so that we could better understand, in his sense, he was saying, so that we as Christians can better understand our faith. That's what he was trying to say. And guess what happened to him? He was labeled a Judaizer. A Judaizer. So in 1514, the Dominican friars, they're busy people. The Dominican friars are busy people. He basically is charged with being a Judaizer. And eventually, he is completely silenced by the church and forbidden from any other verbal advocacy. Because before this, he was basically arguing with the Dominican friars and saying, no, we should be reading these books. So there's that. How many of you have heard of a little-known figure known as Martin Luther? Martin Luther, yes. So in 1542, let's back up. In the 1500 time frame, that era, Martin Luther comes around, and he is the great reformer, right? He's the father of the Protestant church in the early 1500s, like 1520s. How many of you know what the word Protestant really means? Protestants, it's the protesters, right? So up until this point, people who are watching or maybe you're listening here in the room, perhaps, I doubt it, but maybe, you might be thinking, well, I don't come from a Catholic background. And so far, everybody has been a Constantine or a church father from the Catholic Church, Dominican friar, Franciscan friar, but I'm Baptist, or I'm whatever, Assemblies of God, or I'm whatever. I'm Protestant. So therefore, this can't apply to me. Well, Martin Luther is considered the father of the Protestant church. And he was protesting indulgences, which an indulgence is you can give so much money And in whatever the amount of money is, you have instant access to heaven. Now, depending on the gift, we have that here at Sar Shalom. No, I'm just kidding. But that's what he was teaching. So he was protesting that aspect. Now, Martin Luther was not necessarily protesting the church and its ways as in totem, like everything. Now, he did allegedly have the revelation about the just shall live by faith. But if you go to a Lutheran church, they're like Catholicism is the Camel cigarette with no filter. Lutheran is the Camel cigarette with the filter on it. So that's pretty much the difference. And that was told to me, by the way, by a Lutheran priest. There's not a whole lot of difference. But the main thing about Martin Luther is that he thought he had the same idea that the Protestant church has today, that it inherited from his soul, that is it's a fallacy. He thought that Jews were under the burden of their law and that they were just longing for a way to get out from underneath it. And so when he had this illumination that the just shall live by faith, he saw that as a revolutionary way to go to Jews, which the church has not been successful at reaching at all, and help them to know that, look, you can just live by faith now and not by doing these works, which are a burden, and I know you think they are. He didn't realize that Jewish people love the Torah, think it's a great joy, a great privilege, a great honor, and would never in a million years even think about doing something else. Okay? That's the general attitude. It was never considered a burden. It was never considered, oh my gosh, No, I'm talking generally. There might have been a group here or maybe one or two people here, but if they were, then they usually became a Christian. So it wasn't those aspects of Christianity, but Martin Luther detracted them, or detoured them rather, but Martin Luther thought it was. So he had this great revelation. He was at odds with the Catholic Church. He was zealous and everything. And he walked up to the church door and he hammered his thesis on the church door, very dramatic. When he went around trying to win over the Jews, and they rejected him just like they rejected the Catholics. And at first, he was an advocate for Jews. He wrote papers about basically how the church is wrong and we can't blame the Jews for hating us and not accepting Messiah because of the way we treated them and all this. But what the problem is that when flocks and flocks of Jews did not convert under his newfound, justification by faith, suddenly his empathy and his Zionistic views became extraordinarily bitter and anti-Semitic. I mean, almost overnight. So he wrote this paper. Now I want to encourage you as homework to download, you can find it online, you Google it, the paper that he wrote in 1542 called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. Now I would encourage you to take that. I found a copy of it online, and I PDF file, downloaded it, read it, and I was appalled. I knew I had read quotes from this work through the years, but I'd never taken the time to actually sit down and read. It's not that long, but I'd never taken the time to just sit down and read it. Now, many of you probably know that Hitler used Martin Luther's theology as a justification for doing what he did, and he quoted directly from Martin Luther. Luther, of course, being German, the Lutheran church is big in Germany, at least it was. Maybe still is, I don't know, but there's a lot of affinity there. Martin Luther wrote in German. He was the first one to produce a Bible in the common man's language. But funny thing that happened about that, and I'm trying to remember the name of the region that this occurred. It doesn't come to my mind off the top of my head, but suddenly, for the first time ever, Martin Luther is using the brand new printing press, and he's printing up these German Bibles, and men are getting a hold of them. That's the first time they've had a Bible in their own language, and they're like, hey, this is exciting. They start reading it, and there was a certain region Starts with an M. Munster, was it Munster? And they began to eat kosher and keep the festivals. Not that one, not that one. Okay, it wasn't that one. I think it was it was like a Moravian community. Anyway, they get the Bible and they're reading it and they're like, "This is so exciting!" And they look, we should eat pork. We should keep Passover. That's what the Bible says. And they start reading all this, and Martin Luther has to quote put down this rebellion that's happening of people that are reading the Bible and following it. And so it's just an example of how it's a problem. It's a problem. So in 1542, he writes this concerning the Jews and their lies. And Luther asks what Christians should do with this damned, rejected race of Jews. That was his paper is trying to answer that question. So here are some highlights from our lovely Martin Luther, which I promise you, if you walk up to your next, your friendly Christian next door and ask what they know about Martin Luther, you'll probably get some real flowery, wonderful. He was the reformer, fought against the Catholic Church, and maybe they know about indulgences, probably not. They probably don't know that, but something about that, But they'll probably won't know that he's responsible for the Holocaust. They probably won't know that 6 million Jewish people died in large part because of his teaching and theology and what he wrote in this paper. So he said, first, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire, and whatever does not burn up should be covered or spread over with dirt, so that no one may ever be able to see a cinder or stone of it. Secondly, their homes should be likewise be broken down and destroyed, for they perpetuate the same things that they do in their synagogues, because the home is the place of worship in Judaism primarily. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmud, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught. None of that is in the Talmud. Okay. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Let them stay at home. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from usury. All their cash and valuables of silver and gold ought to be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. Isn't that what Germany did? They confiscated everything. Seventhly, let the young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe and the hoe, the spade, the distaff, and the spindle, and let them earn their bread as is enjoined upon Adam's children. Now, isn't that sick? They're referring to Jews as Adam's children. Why not all mankind? But they're saying here that Jews need to be put into essentially slave labor. That's what the concentration camps were originally all about. It was slave labor. That's what they had. The Nazis had the sign on there that said, work will set you free, I believe was the phrase. Work will set you free. If, however, we are afraid that they might harm us personally or our wives, children, and servants and cattle, when they serve us or work for us, then let us apply the same cleverness, expulsion that is, as other nations such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc., and settle with them for that which they have extorted usury from us. And after having divided up fairly, let us drive them out of the country for all time. So he's advocating another expulsion. And he's saying, and by the way, they're all liars and cheaters financially. So let's take all their possessions, spread it around to all of us, and then we'll send them out. Oops, I'm so sorry. So this is everything that Hitler did, only he added the final solution to it as well. Now, what I've just read from Martin Luther's work on the Jews and their lies is really just a small portion of the rhetoric. It's really phenomenal. I don't know what the word is, phenomenal, or it's disturbing or whatever when you read everything that led up to this solution. But again, I think that Martin Luther ultimately is a despicable person in history. But it does teach us that coming from a Protestant background, as so many people do, this is the type of spirit that kind of flows in that movement. And that's what we've got to deal with. One final thing before we kind of conclude our class today. How many of you have heard the term or the cliche, beyond the pale? Right? How many of you know that that applies to Jewish people? That's a Jewish cliche, beyond the pale. So in Poland, when Russia was ruling that region under the Tsars, Jews were confined to certain regions, certain cities, certain locales. And there were pales that were set out. And Jewish people were forbidden from traveling beyond the pale. That's where that comes from. So going beyond the pale is pushing the envelope as a Jewish person to go beyond the border that you've been set within the country. It was also in Poland, it was around the same time period that the Tsars would come and forcibly remove the Jewish boys. They started out, I believe, at age 13, but then they went as young as 9 and 10, and took them off for Russian military service. And they would stay in Russian military service for 25 and 30 years. But they did this so that they could control the Jewish communities in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, the Eastern Bloc. It's just something else to think. When you think about anti-Semitism, there's so many horrors about it. But can you imagine that your little 10-year-old boy gets picked up by a Russian, army unit, and that's it, 25, 30 years later. And of course, they were taken there, and they were beaten, and they were mistreated, and the point was to try to get them not to be Jewish, basically to try to assimilate them into not Soviet, that's later, but into Russian life. All right. Any questions, comments, or input? Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, taking all their wealth, right? And she was talking about the Jews who were in the concentration camps before they went to the gas chambers. They would take all their wealth, even take the gold out of their teeth, and it's large part of that is dehumanizing. This completely dehumanizing the person. So, thank God we live in a country where we don't experience this level of anti-Semitism overtly. But, the thing I think that we've learned as we're going through history is that is always subject to change. And there's always a potential. And I think that many of us experience soft anti-Semitism and sometimes from our friends, oftentimes from our Christian friends, but we experience that soft anti-Semitism. When we even as something as simple as trying to order a meal or something like that, or trying to figure out what to cook or for relatives. But prayerfully, our country will, God will spare us, and we'll continue to have a safe haven here, and not have to be like it is in France, where we have to make kippas out of our own hair. That'd be bad for me, since I don't have much hair, really. I don't know what I would do in that case. So, Baruch Hashem. Well, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week for week number 5.